Hi guys, welcome to LBS. Today's lesson is going to be about how to balance your life and how to live with purpose. In the past couple weeks, we've talked about your purpose in life, sharing your story and your testimony. And today, I want to share with you guys what it looks like to balance and to live a well-balanced life. I think especially in times like these, it's important to remind ourselves of what that looks like. And so to start off, I want to read to you the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. So the Great Commandment in Matthew 22, verse 37, says, "And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.'" So remember that. And then the Great Commission, Matthew 28. Matthew 28 is the Great Commission. It says, "Go therefore make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and I am with you always, even to the end of the age." So our life purpose and God's purpose for us is 5 points, and it comes from those two passages. So the first purpose that God has for us is to love the Lord God with all of our heart. So what that looks like is to be a true worshiper. So our first and foremost purpose is to love God. The second purpose that God gives us in the Great Commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, to serve your neighbors, serve your community. And then the third point comes from the Great Commission, which is to go and make disciples, right? So our purpose, our vision for House Church is to evangelize and to go reach out to the unbelievers and unchurched people. The fourth purpose is baptizing them into. So once we've reached out, we bring them into the church. And the fifth point, to teach them to do all things, so discipleship. So the 5 purposes that God has for us comes from Great Commandment and Great Commission. Again, to love God with all your heart, to love your neighbor as yourself, go and make disciples, so evangelism, baptize them into, so the fellowship, and then teach them, so discipleship. So when we know to do all these things, right, all these 5 points, it's a lot. So you start to think, okay, do I love God first? Or, how about reaching out? Okay, but what about discipleship? What about my house church? How do I do that? And so it gets a little overwhelming, right, when you think about all the 5 purposes that God has for us. But it says here, a great commitment to the Great Commandment and the Great Commission will make you a great Christian. And so these 5 points really summarizes God's purposes for our lives. But how do we do that, right? Like, how do we ensure that we're doing all these things and we're juggling? I think life is constantly a lesson of juggling all the priorities in our lives, and all of these things are really, truly, really important. But there's a couple things that we can do practically in order to remain focused and remain on our purpose. One of the things we can do is to talk to a small group or our house church with them, and to be able to process our purpose with them. Another thing is to talk through it with our LBS class. So what we'll share today after the lesson is what your purpose will look like. Something else it's important to do and to remind ourselves of is to do a regular checkup, a health checkup. So if you think about like a doctor who does, you do routine checkups with them, it's important that we continue to ask God, God, how am I doing? How are we doing spiritually? And I think this kind of goes back to the first point, in sharing time, we always ask you to share how you're doing spiritually. And I think that's something that's so important to share about, because if we're not constantly thinking about how we're doing spiritually, we can easily get caught up in the worldly things, or caught up in doing things that are distracting or not really serving our purpose. And so doing a health checkup constantly, a spiritual checkup within ourselves. Something else that we can do is to write down, to journal these things. And so I shared this in the lesson about 2 weeks ago about journaling and how important it is to write down these things. And we should always keep a journal of our life lessons, the things that God has brought us to. So I have a journal that's with me, usually that I write down what I've learned, what God's been teaching me in this season. I'm not a daily journaler, but I'm somebody that does like to keep record of things, because when I write them down, it helps me commit them to memory, and so I remember them more. I kind of think of this as like, if you read in the Old Testament, Jacob would, set up an altar whenever God did something for them, and God really blessed them, or, something happened that God spoke to them about. Jacob would build an altar, right? And so I feel like writing down these things in our journals is almost like a remembrance, is writing down the stories and the things in which God has took us to, the lessons that he took us through. And so continuously write down the altars that we want to remember God and his work in our lives with. And the last point, I think, is one of my favorite ones, is to pass on what you know to other people. So that's like what we're doing as LBS teachers, as adult shepherds. We can only teach and share what we've learned and our life lessons, in hopes that one of the SNY students would be able to identify with our lessons and to be able to grow from those experiences. And I want to encourage you guys, if you're shepherds, or you're just a student leader, whatever it may be, to pass on to your house church members what you've learned. And it's so important to do that, because we're continuously trying to pass on what we've learned to the future generations. And so those are just a couple of habits that we should develop in our daily lives in order to continue to remain on purpose and to remain on point, right? And so so the next one I want to talk about is how to live with purpose and a purpose statement. So a purpose statement is really important, because if any one of you guys is like me, growing up, I struggled with my identity. Who am I? I think even people, my age probably still do, if we're not really living with purpose and knowing who our identity is really in. And I've questioned, if what I'm doing really is important, am I doing it for the kingdom of God? And we constantly struggle with these things if we're not refocusing and reshifting our minds towards our purpose, towards the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. And so it's important to develop a purpose statement in our lives. And so for me, I, after going over this lesson, wrote down a purpose statement, which I'll share with you later. But it was really impactful as I started to review my purpose statement, because it's so good to write these things down, like our vision, our calling, like what God has called us to. And we're going to constantly, I think, shape it and tweak at it until we've really felt like God has given us that statement and what we've lived for and what our purpose in life is for. But what is your purpose statement? So it summarizes God's purpose for your life, and it helps you define, what does success mean to you? So, everyone's different. Everyone's vision of success is different. So where do you, at what point do you say that I've made it? Or at what point would you say that you've grown, that you've accomplished? And I think when I heard the purpose statement, when I started learning about it, it reminded me of like a resume. And so if anyone's writing resumes, maybe the seniors are, or the juniors are already writing resumes, but we always look for, in the resume on the top, a purpose statement. And it basically is like a couple sentences of what your purpose in applying to this company or to this job is for. And it's important in a couple ways, because one, it helps the employer to see that you have a vision, that you have something that you are aiming for. And two, it shows that you take it very seriously. And I think that it's very parallel to even the spiritual purpose statement that we're talking about here, because in order for us to know our purpose, we have to write it down and we have to really think about it. So I'm going to walk you through a couple points and some questions you can ask yourself in order to draft out your purpose statement. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, what will be the center of my life? Who are you going to live for? Who will you worship? What will you worship? What will you put in the middle? Because constantly in our lives, we're going to be thrown different things. And each one of these things will want to take the throne of your heart. So we have to remind ourselves what or who will be the center of it. When you gave your life to Christ, Christ came and he became the center. But we have to work at continuing to make God the center of our lives. So writing down who will be or what will be the center of your life. Next, I want you to write down what will be the character of my life. So what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of person do you want others to see you as? God is far more interested in what you are than what you do. So it's not about your accomplishments, what school you get into, but it's about what you are. And so, how do you want to grow in your character? And I want to read to you 1 Peter 1, 5 through 7. And talks about godly characters here in this passage. And it says here, now for this very reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence, knowledge, in your knowledge, self-control, in your self-control, perseverance, in your perseverance, godliness, and in your godliness, brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness, love. So here's a couple of character traits, right, that we can even pull from the Bible. And there's a lot in here, but this is just one passage. Do you want to grow in your knowledge, in your perseverance, self-control? What are some character traits that you want to work on? So developing those and identifying which ones that you want to grow in. The next question is, what will be the contribution of my life? So, what will be your ministry? And we took a SHAPE test not too long ago, and we wrote down basically what our top 3 things were that we felt like we're good at, right? We took a test, it was 60 questions long, and it really shows you the things that you are good at and the things we need to develop. And so take your SHAPE, take the things that you are good at, and how do you want to use those things that God has developed you in, that has blessed you with, to serve in the ministry. Next is, what will be the communication of my life? So how do I want to communicate my life to other people? It's a little bit different from the character traits, because your character traits are qualities, right, that you're growing in. But what is the message that you want to share with your unbeliever friends? And how do you want to show them that your life is purposeful? So what kind of message do you want to communicate to them? And then lastly, what will be the community? So expressing your love for God's church, and how will you demonstrate your commitment to other believers and the connection to the family of God? And so what is your community, and how do you want to serve God's church, right? Because the church is the bride. And so in what areas do you want to serve in this ministry? I know that you might question, what about God's will for my job, for my marriage? What about what school I'm going to go to? But it's, I'm reminded actually of our discussion this morning from Holy Sexuality in the Gospel, that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're married, whether you're single, if you have kids, if you don't, if you go to UT or A&M or U of H, or whatever Ivy League school, because all of these things really don't matter. And I'm sorry to tell you that, but it doesn't, because your purpose in life isn't any of these things. And if you're putting your main goal and your purpose in the school or a spouse or even a relationship, then you're getting it wrong, right? And I understand, because I was once there, and I used to put my identity in a relationship or in marriage, but these things are not our purpose. And it's so important that regardless of where you are, that our purpose on this life is to fulfill God's mission. So it really isn't purposeful if it's not God's purpose, right? And so God really wants to use you. I think that it's so important at this time of our lives to really focus on what God has for us and what his plan is for us. And David in the book of Acts was known as a man who fulfilled God's mission and God's purpose. In Acts 13:36, and I'll read that to you. It's a short passage, short verse. And it says, "For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay." So God clearly states here that David fulfilled his purpose, and he fell asleep and went with God, right? And I don't know about you, but I want to be known as somebody who has fulfilled God's purpose. I want, God to write in my book, for Tina, after she had served God's purpose, fell asleep and was laid to rest with God. And I think it's such a beautiful thing that if we can get our purpose statement right at a young age, then the rest of our lives will not be wasted because we'll be focused on the right things. We won't be distracted or focused on things that don't matter because we can't take those things into heaven, into eternity. And again, I want to remind you of the eternity line that this life on earth is just this piece and eternity is forever. So what will we spend our time on, right? And I'll share with you my purpose statement. It's a work in progress, so bear with me. But and I still corrected it even right before I came here, right, to record this. But it says, I will put God at the center and at the top of my life and strive to keep him there. I will seek to extend love and grace in all circumstances. I will uphold myself to self-control and godliness. I will guide the younger generation to do the same and share God's love to the broken and the lonely. Others will see my life and want to get to know the God that I serve, that they would know that there's more to this life than what meets the surface. There is a loving Abba Father waiting for us to turn to him. And it's simple because it's the gospel and it's the story of my salvation. And so I want to remind you the 5 purposes of our lives. It's to love God with all your heart, to be a true worshiper. It's to love your neighbor as yourself. It's to go and make disciples, baptizing them into and teaching them to do all these things. And so as we wrap up this class, I want to encourage you guys to think about your purpose statement. I want you to share with your class, what do you want people to remember you as after you die? What do you want your book to look like? What's your story? And after you pass, what kind of, story are you leaving behind? Where will you be in the next 10 years, right? Maybe death is just too far for you to think about. But what about in 10 years? Where do you want to be? What's your purpose statement at that time? And take time to write down your purpose statement and share with your class. So you may not have time after this to write right away, but next week I want you guys to write it down and to share in the next class. So good luck, and I can't wait to hear your purpose statements. Bye.